Welcome back. In this lecture, I will transition from focusing on the Celts themselves to the ways in which Celtic heritage was rediscovered by scholars and reappropriated by people in the Celtic areas who believed that connecting with the Celtic past had meaning for them in the present. Modern notions of Celtic nationalism all derive from this scholarly tradition that began in the 16th century. There is some irony involved in this story, and the Celtic traditions are not strangers to irony. Just as Ireland was being finally conquered by the English, and the Jacobite rebellions were leading to a decline in traditional Gaelic culture in the Highlands and Islands in Scotland, scholars were uncovering the relationships between the Celtic languages, and several important translations of supposedly ancient Celtic texts took the European literary world by storm. The Celtic phenomenon thus became wildly popular among non-Celtic speakers only after any conceivable military threat from actual Celts had largely disappeared. In this lecture, I will range very widely over the Celtic world, including a brief discussion of Ireland, but mostly focusing on Scotland and Wales. The story of the intersection between scholarship and the Celts begins in the late 16th century with a Scottish scholar named George Buchanan. He was the first to discover the linguistic relationship among the Celtic languages and to popularize the notion of a Celtic race. Buchanan had a colorful career. He briefly tutored the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots in Latin. But during Mary's reign, he converted to Presbyterianism. And after Mary was driven into exile, Buchanan became one of the tutors to the young James VI, who loathed Buchanan for lecturing him constantly about the limitations of the rights of kings and for making sure his royal charge got regular beatings. Buchanan was also instrumental in implicating the exiled queen in the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley. So his political track record was interesting, to say the least. But for our purposes, it is Buchanan the scholar we need to focus on, not Buchanan the politician. A native speaker of Scottish Gaelic, as the word is pronounced in Scotland, Buchanan was also a phenomenally talented linguist who wrote prolifically in both Latin and Scots, the form of English spoken in Scotland. He was, in fact, a leading light of the European Renaissance. And here is where the two main parts of his intellectual makeup met. He had learned in his youth some of the more fanciful stories about where the Irish and the Scots had come from. That is, the traditions embodied in the Irish Book of Invasions, which had also been carried over into the Scottish traditions. This tradition traced the origins of the Scots and the Irish to Scythia in Central Asia, and even in some versions to Troy. But being a skeptical Renaissance man, Buchanan did not believe them. So Buchanan decided to investigate the origins of the Scots, and by extension the Irish, on his own terms. To do this, he invented a scholarly methodology, which was to investigate similarities in language and religion, and especially place names, among several different peoples. He identified place names with common elements, such as the luch prefix that we see in places all over Europe, and that probably indicates a common cult of the god Luch. This kind of evidence helped Buchanan piece together the theory that the Celtic speakers of the British Isles were related to the Celtic speakers of continental Europe. He didn't get everything right. Although he believed the Picts were similar in language to the Celts, he saw the Picts as coming from Scythia, perhaps as a way of trying to rescue some part of the older tradition. Now we know that this is totally wrong. But the biggest contribution Buchanan made was clearly to make a connection between Britain and the continent, and to say, these are all Celts, they are one people. And this gave the Celtic speakers of Scotland a kind of classical credibility that was rather important in an age when the Celtic languages were under assault. Suddenly, Buchanan's fellow Celts were related to the people who had almost successfully defied Julius Caesar. Ironically, Buchanan's work on the origins of the Scots brought the stories of the Book of Invasions back into the headlines, so to speak. Because Buchanan was a major figure, his study of the Celts was widely read, and it prompted another extremely important intellectual, the English poet Sir Edmund Spenser, to weigh in on the question of the origins of the Irish. The reason is that Spenser spent several decades in the 1580s and 90s as a colonial administrator in Ireland, and he was actually driven from Ireland by rebels during the 9 Years' War in the 1590s. And in response, he wrote a blistering attack on Irish culture. One of the points he wanted to refute strongly was the connection that is made in the Book of Invasions between Ireland and Spain. It's not a mystery why this would be controversial in the 1590s. The English had just defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, but Spain had responded to this defeat by making an alliance with the Irish rebels. So it was a good time to try to squelch any thought that there might be any sort of kinship between the Spanish and the Irish. But if people like George Buchanan and Sir Edmund Spenser were attacking the traditions embodied in the Book of Invasions, there were also scholars who passionately defended the historical value of these traditions, including an Irish Catholic priest named Shahrún Caitin, known more commonly under his English name as Geoffrey Keating. Keating was from an Old English family, that is, a family that derived its descent from English settlers that had stayed Catholic. And he had obviously adopted an Irish cultural identity, though he remained loyal to the Stuart dynasty. He was also a product of the main intellectual currents in the late Renaissance, having studied at the Irish College in Bordeaux in France, which had been set up in the early 17th century to educate Irish Catholics, whose religion barred them from studying in English or Irish universities. Keating became fascinated by Irish history, and in 1634, he completed a book entitled Foras Fassa ar Éireann, or The Foundation of Knowledge on Ireland. He could not print the book because it was explicitly pro-Catholic, but it did circulate in manuscript, and Keating's learned status helped to keep belief in the semi-legendary traditions of early Irish history alive well into the 18th century and beyond. The real scholarly progress on Celtic linguistics, though, was going to take place not in Ireland, but in the Brittonic world, about 100 years later, with the work of a French scholar named Paul-Yves Pézeran, who lived from 1639 to 1706. Pézeran was a Cistercian monk from Brittany, so he was familiar with the Breton language. In 1703, he published a book entitled Antiquité de la nation et de la langue celte autrement appelée gaulois, which was translated into English 3 years later as The Antiquities of Nations, more particularly of the Celtae, or Gauls. Pézeran is best known for coining the term Celtic language, and he saw similarities between the Celtic languages and Greek and Latin. Basically, Pézeran was reaching toward the methodology of comparative linguistics. He believed Breton was the last remnant of Gaulish, which he thought was derived from a language spoken at the time of the Tower of Babel. This was not exactly right, of course, since Breton was actually the speech of the immigrants from Britain who had arrived in Brittany in the 5th century, but he was at least in the right ballpark. And in fact, one of his most important contributions was to identify the connection between Breton and Welsh, and from now on, the Welsh, too, were seen to be Celts. And when Pézeran's work was translated into English, it was in fact a Welshman who picked up the ball and ran with it. Edward Llwyd, who lived from 1660 to 1709, was the curator of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, and he ran in exalted intellectual circles. He was a friend of Sir Isaac Newton. Llwyd was very aware of what was going on in the field of early Celtic studies, and he was a great admirer of Pézeran. Llwyd compared vocabulary words from Welsh, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Cornish, and Breton, and his great contribution was to bring all the Celtic languages together for the first time. It's interesting that he personally did not want to use the term Celtic for the languages of the British Isles and Ireland, but he did see the relationships between them and he made a crucial discovery. Llwyd was the first to recognize the sound changes between Welsh and Irish, that is, the distinction between Q Celtic and P Celtic we discussed in earlier lectures. Llwyd also invented the terms Goidelic and Brittonic for the speakers of Q Celtic and P Celtic, respectively, and he named them after characters in the Book of Invasions. So by the early 18th century, scholars had made huge strides in recognizing the kinship between the Celtic languages, and also how they should be classified with regard to each other. Up until this point, nobody really knew that the Irish and the Welsh had anything in common other than hating the English. This scholarly work on the Celtic languages crossed over into popular culture in the 18th century in a huge way, partly driven by current events. And this is when I need to do a brief digression into the story of the Jacobites. The Jacobites were, of course, the fanatical romantic faction that supported the exiled Stuart family, the descendants of James VII of Scotland and II of England, who had been driven from both the English and Scottish thrones in 1688 for being completely incompetent and gratuitously offensive to their subjects. The Jacobites get their name from the name Jacobus, which is simply the Latin form of James. A brief spoiler alert, the Jacobites ultimately lost. But between 1689 and 1745, there was a whole series of attempts, some of them more well-developed than others, to restore the Stuarts to the British throne. The last attempt ended in April 1746 with the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Culloden of James II's grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. The British commander, the Duke of Cumberland, younger son of King George II, became known for his savage reprisals against the Jacobites as the Butcher of Culloden. And by the way, this nickname was given to him by his own brother. The British government's reaction to the Jacobite Rising of 1745 had very important ramifications for the story of the Celts. Let's go back for a moment to the Battle of Culloden. This battle is often popularly believed to have been a clash between Highlanders on the Jacobite side and Lowlanders and Englishmen on the government side. And this is emphatically not the case. There were speakers of Scottish Gaelic on both sides of the conflict. There is some beautiful Gaelic poetry that mourns the death of the Jacobite soldiers. But on the other hand, one of the most intriguing artifacts that was retrieved from the battlefield was a Gaelic Bible that belonged to a soldier loyal to King George. But the British government did not see the situation with this kind of nuance. Instead, they associated all Highlanders with rebels, and they decided to carry out the kind of Anglicizing policy that had been pursued in Ireland at the time of the Tudor conquest there. Let's try to get these people to look and act more like Englishmen, or at least Lowland Scots. So in 1746, the British passed the Dress Act, which banned the use of tartan, the distinctive multicolored checked cloth worn in the Highlands, except that Scottish regiments could use it within the British Army. Now, the idea behind banning tartan was clearly to undermine the solidarity of the Highland clans, and also to try to assimilate the Highlanders into lowland culture. There's an interesting parallel here to the efforts made by the English in Ireland to get the Irish to dress in the English manner. The Dress Act was widely resented, and in fact, it ended up creating a kind of radical tartan chic. But let's back up and do a quick history of tartan and why it matters. Its origins are obscure. Tartan-like textiles were produced in the 8th to the 6th centuries BC in the Hallstatt culture in Central Europe, and remains of such textiles were actually discovered in 2004. But since we also see similar patterns in Western China, it's hard to say how distinctive they are, much less to make a direct connection between, say, Hallstatt and Scotland. The earliest surviving fragment of a British tartan dates to the 3rd century AD from a pot found at Falkirk in Stirlingshire, which is just north of the Antonine Wall. It was found in a pot with 2,000 Roman coins. But tartan was also used in Jutland in Denmark around the same time. But then we have a hiatus where it's not mentioned. We just don't have any evidence about it. Tartan, as we think of it, next appears in the 16th century, when we suddenly find lots of references in written sources to striped or checked plaids. And by the late 17th and early 18th centuries, standardized forms had developed. A Gallic-speaking scholar with the rather unprepossessing name of Martin Martin wrote a book in 1703 called A Description of the Western Islands of Scotland. In this book, he noted that the different islands and regions had their own patterns of tartan, and this is just how the weavers in that area happened to produce the cloth, based on what local dyes were available. But note that this is a regional thing, not a clan thing. There would be some overlap, of course, between region and clan, but nobody is yet claiming that there is a Campbell tartan or a MacDonald tartan, and you might have had MacDonalds who lived in different valleys wearing different tartans. The one place where tartans really are standardized, ironically, was in the British Army. A group of Highlanders could be a riotously colorful bunch, so there was a drive to standardize their tartans by regiment. And ironically, this standardization within the British Army may have ultimately led to the idea of clan tartans, about which I'll say more shortly. But of course, by forbidding the wearing of tartan for civilians in 1746, the English were almost inevitably creating a mystique around tartan, and the odd effect seems to have been to expand the meaning of tartan from a marker of Highland or Gallic identity to a marker of Scottish identity writ large. And tartan was not the only Celtic phenomenon that was controversial in the 18th century. I want to talk now about one of the most famous literary debates of all time. It concerns a series of poems published beginning in 1760 by the Scottish poet James Macpherson, who claimed that these poems were translations from an ancient book written in Gaelic. The poems drew on tales familiar from Irish tradition, such as the stories from the Finn cycle about the great hero Finn McCool and his son Oisin, who travels across the sea to the otherworld with his fairy lover, only to return and discover that 300 years have passed in Ireland in what seemed to him the blink of an eye. Oisin is cast as the bardic narrator of the poems, and they also include references to the Ulster cycle stories about the hero Cuchulainn. Now let me give you a sample of what this text sounds like. Cuchulainn sat by Tura's wall. He spoke like a wave on a rock. Who in this land appears like me? Heroes stand not in my presence. They fall to earth from my hand. Who can meet Swaran in fight? Who but Fingal, king of Selma of storms? Once we wrestled on Malmore, our heels overturned the woods. Rocks fell from their place. Rivulets, changing their course, fled murmuring from our side. 3 days we renewed the strife. Heroes stood at a distance and trembled. I think Macpherson is probably capturing an 18th century sensibility rather than that of the ancient bards, but he did his job supremely well. These poems were hugely popular. They were translated into all the major European languages, and they had a huge influence on Romanticism. Napoleon supposedly loved the poems, and they inspired works of art and music, such as Felix Mendelssohn's overture entitled Fingal's Cave, named for a natural rock formation in the Inner Hebrides that received this name in tribute to Macpherson's poems. But if the general public fell hard for Oisin, who was proclaimed in some quarters the Celtic equivalent of Homer, some members of the literary establishment began to raise questions right away. First, Irish people were angry that these texts were claimed for Scotland. But more seriously, doubts were raised about the authenticity of the poems. Where were the original texts on which these so-called translations were based? Macpherson never produced them. Samuel Johnson, the famous compiler of the first real English dictionary, said Macpherson was a mountebank, a liar, and a fraud, and that the poems were forgeries. He was asked, "But Dr. Johnson, do you really believe that any man today could write such poetry?" He replied, "Yes, many men, many women, and many children." Of course, Johnson hated Gaelic, which he called the rude speech of a barbarous people. But others leapt to Macpherson's defense. Scottish author Hugh Blair's defense in 1763 was included in every edition of the poems thereafter. But Irish author Charles O'Connor said it was a forgery, and the controversy continued into the early 19th century and beyond. These days, the modern scholarly consensus is that Macpherson probably really did draw on original sources, but they were mostly oral. He gathered lots of ballads that contained traditional stories, many of which drew on traditions that were common to both Ireland and Scotland. And then he created a kind of fake bardic epic with a lot of Macpherson-esque touches. Ironically, some of the stories have since been discovered in medieval Scottish manuscripts that Macpherson probably didn't have access to. So the Oisin hoax, if we can call it that, ends up demonstrating that the tradition on which he drew was pretty authentic after all. He really only got himself in trouble because he went a little too far in claiming that he had one written source and that these poems were all the work of Oisin himself. It's a bit similar to how Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century took a bunch of tales about King Arthur and claimed that he found them in a single manuscript in the British language. Both Macpherson and Geoffrey of Monmouth wanted the credibility that came with having a written source, and both authors have been controversial ever since. They should have just copped to it and used footnotes. But the Oisin craze helped to drive a renewed fascination with all things Scottish. In 1778, the Highland Society was founded in London so that expatriate Scots could get together and talk about Scottish culture. And note that this was specifically related to Highland culture, that is, the Gaelic-speaking areas, though the language of the society in London was definitely English. The profile of Scottish culture was raised even higher in 1782, when lobbying efforts by a Scottish nobleman led to the repeal of the Highland Dress Act. By that time, it was fairly clear that the Jacobites were no longer a threat. Bonnie Prince Charlie, now in exile on the continent, was a rather less dashing 62-year-old with no legitimate heirs, and his younger brother was a Catholic cardinal, and hence precluded from taking the English throne. And by now, Highland regiments, dressed in their distinctive tartan, had demonstrated their valor on many British imperial battlefields around the world. So tartan became less associated with rebellion and more with valiant military service. Upon the repeal of the Act, the following address was offered in English and Gaelic. "Listen, men, this is bringing before all the sons of the Gael. The King and Parliament of Britain have forever abolished the Act against the Highland dress, which came down to the clans from the beginning of the world to the year 1746. This must bring great joy to every Highland heart. You are no longer bound down to the unmanly dress of the Lowlander. This is declaring to every man, young and old, simple and gentle, that they may after this put on and wear the trews, the little kilt, the coat, and the striped hose, as also the belted plaid, without fear of the law of the realm or the spite of the enemies." So far, so good. But now we get a fascinating twist to the story. So far, tartans were, as I've said, a local thing. You wore the tartan of your locality. But after this 36-year hiatus, where these local traditions were abrogated, we get this period of tartan revival and Highland chic. And now tartans get associated with particular clans. These are supposedly ancient associations, but they're really not. But the Highland Society of London in 1815 mandated tartans for each clan. Note, though, that an organization in London is now presuming to tell Scottish clans what their proper tartans should be. But even if we concede that the concept of the clan tartan is a bit artificial, it has turned out to be a stroke of marketing genius. and the person who takes a huge amount of the credit is, ironically, a lowland Scot who spoke no Gaelic, the famous Scottish poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott. In 1820, he founded the Celtic Society of Edinburgh, which put on a huge festival in 1822. Scots were urged to come, all plaided and plumed in their tartan array. As I said, Scott was a lowlander. His ancestors had for sure never worn tartan, but somehow the tartan had now become associated with Scottishness in general, as opposed to Highland Scottishness in particular. And the tartan phenomenon got a huge boost when King George IV visited the festival in 1822 and appeared fully outfitted in royal Stuart tartan. Contemporary satirists made great hay of the elderly and rather corpulent Hanoverian king dressed up in tartan finery, but most regarded the king's outfit, the way he intended it, as a sincere effort to flatter his Scottish subjects. Still, not all Scots were on board with the rise of tartan. The most famous tartan skeptic is the Victorian historian Lord Macaulay, who rather pointedly noted that before the Jacobite Rising, tartan dress was looked down on by lowlanders, who tended to see Highlanders as uncivilized and even criminal. Macaulay referred to King George's visit as follows: "The last British king who held a court in Holyrood," that's Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, "thought that he could not give a more striking proof of his respect for the usages which had prevailed in Scotland before the Union than by disguising himself in what, before the Union, was considered by 9 Scotchmen out of 10 as the dress of a thief." But the fact is that opinions in Scotland had dramatically changed. Tartan was now in, and it still is. After King George's visit, it was de rigueur for members of the royal family to wear tartan in Scotland, even for Queen Victoria's very German consort, Prince Albert, not exactly a Celt. In less than a century, tartan had gone from the dress of a hated pack of rebels to the national dress of Scotland. This was some pretty powerful rebranding. Now, some people are disillusioned when they learn that clan tartans are not a very ancient tradition. But here's how I see it. By now, it's a 200-year-old myth, which is ancient enough for me. So go, buy your clan tartan, wear it in good health. My Scottish relatives came from Berwickshire, which is just barely over the border from England, so not the Highlands. And I still love my supposed family tartan. Why not? At the same time that Scottish culture was tending in a decidedly Celtic direction, a Celtic revival was underway in Wales as well. It began in the mid-18th century with a renewed fascination with the Druids, which had ironically been touched off first by an English vicar named William Stukeley. He first proposed the idea that the Druids had worshipped in stone monuments like Stonehenge and Avebury, which we now know is not true. A much earlier German writer had already suggested that Druids wore white robes. We have no evidence for this whatsoever, and the idea stuck. The Druid craze spread to Wales, and the first Druidic society was founded on the Welsh island of Anglesey in 1772. This was at least correct. Anglesey really was a stronghold of Druidism at the time of the Romans. At the same time as the Druids were getting going again, there was a serious effort to revive the old traditions of the Welsh bards. Way back in 1176, a powerful Welsh ruler called the Lord Rhys of Deheubarth had held a poetry competition at his court at Cardigan. Such an event was called an Eisteddfod, which in Welsh just means session. These competitions continued during the Middle Ages, but they fell into abeyance in the 17th century. Then they were revived in 1789 when Thomas Jones created an event that was opened to the public for the first time. The most famous figure in the Welsh revival was Iolo Morgannwg, who was interested in both poetry and Druids. His real name was a lot less exotic sounding. He was called Edward Williams. In 1792, Morgannwg founded the Gorsedd Verd Ynys Prydain, an organization for the bards of the island of Britain, to put the revived Eisteddfod on a sound footing. The interesting thing to note here is that this organization first met in London, just like the Highland Society. In fact, Morgannwg had only really gotten interested in Welsh matters when he went to London and started hanging out with other Welsh people in the Gwenedigion Society, which had been founded in 1770 to bring Welsh people in the capital together. It's ironic that so much of the work of the Celtic revival happened not in the actual Celtic fringe countries, but in the metropolis. Iolo Morgannwg was not just an organizer of Welsh cultural events, he was also an author. And I use the term advisedly, because although Morgannwg claimed to be publishing ancient Welsh texts, he clearly forged a lot of his manuscripts. Iolo was very determined to prove continuity with the ancient Druids and ancient bards, and in some cases he went a bit too far. In 1789, he forged poems by the very famous 14th century Welsh poet Dafydd ap Gwilym, whom I discussed in my lecture on medieval Wales. So this is a bit similar to Macpherson forging the poems about Oisin, but it's an even more blatant imposture. Let me hasten to say that the music and poetry on offer at the modern Eisteddfod is not fake in the least. The Eisteddfod continues, and today it is considered one of the key cultural institutions of Wales. If the poetic revival is flourishing, the Druid revival is still alive and well also, but it is divided into two main branches. One strand of Druidism went into an explicitly religious neo-pagan direction. Around the turn of the 20th century, these neo-pagan Druids began worshipping at Stonehenge, ironically just as archaeologists were determining for sure that Stonehenge was much too old to have been built by actual Druids. But that didn't seem to bother anybody, because they are still doing it. I was once at Stonehenge on June 22nd, right after the summer solstice, with a group of students, and we got to see actual Druids in their white robes. So what if the white robe tradition is only a couple of hundred years old? So that's one branch of the modern Druid movement, but there is another branch that embraces Druidism in a totally non-sectarian way. These are the members of the Ancient Order of Druids, which was founded in London in 1781 as a fraternal organization, similar to the Masons. One of my favorite images to illustrate the difference between the two branches of modern Druidism is a picture of a very young Winston Churchill being inaugurated into the Albion Lodge of the Ancient Order of Druids of Oxford at Blenheim Palace, the home of his grandfather, the Duke of Marlborough. So this branch of Druids had clearly gone establishment. The Celtic revival in Scotland and Wales thus contained a fascinating mixture of genuine tradition, well-meaning forgery based on authentic texts, and outright invention. But it is now all authentically part of the modern culture of the Celtic lands.